I'm Alexis Jetter. I teach journalism here in the English department, also in Women and Gender Studies. And it's my pleasure to introduce Sevgil Musaieva, which I know I'm mangling, and you're very kind about that. Sevgil came to my class this afternoon, my journalism class, and talked both about the current situation in the Ukraine and also specifically about the dangers and challenges of being an investigative reporter in Ukraine, where it is a deadly atmosphere for investigative reporters, including two of her colleagues who've been murdered over the years. So very serious business to do the work that you do. A few introductions first before I get to Sevgil. This lecture today is possible only because the Bernard Nossiter Foundation provides the opportunity to bring people like Sevgil, who are fellows at the Nieman Foundation at Harvard. They take mid-career journalists. They're selected, a very difficult selection process from all over the world. They come to Harvard for a year to do their research, take classes, bicycle, we are the beneficiaries of the Nossiter Foundation, which brings one of them each year to Dartmouth to talk about their work. I also want to thank, and it's named for Bernard Nossiter, who was a Dartmouth grad, was a remarkable Washington Post foreign correspondent and the author of 5 books. I also want to thank the Rockefeller Center and the Tuck School of Business for making this possible. So Sevgil is the editor-in-chief of the online newspaper Ukrayinska Pravda, which means Pravda, Ukraine. Pravda, for those of you who don't know, it means truth. Of course, it's named after the Russian newspaper Pravda, which challenges its definition. But in this case, Sevgil and her colleagues work very hard at exposing the corrupt links between oligarchs in the Ukraine, oligarchs in Russia, politicians in the Ukraine, corruption within the army, even as it fights a kind of Cold War against Russian intervention. It's a big, fat mess, and it's very difficult to expose it and to cover it. And her talk today is called Truth is Our Math, How Do We Rebuild Trust in Media When the Society is Polarized? And for those of you who have been following events in the Ukraine, things there keep taking stranger and stranger turns, even popping up in the Trump versus Biden war of words. And we're lucky to have Sevgil today to help explain it. Some of what's going on there is fun, some of it is grim. You may know, for example, that the newest president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, is a comedian. Who played a president on a wildly popular TV show called Servant of the People. He has no political experience, and he's used Instagram, Twitter, and slick videos to project himself into the living room of Ukrainians who voted for him overwhelmingly just last month, by 73%. 73% of Ukrainians voted for someone who they only knew from television. I mean, there's some parallels there in our own experience. And he beat a chocolate magnate who's been implicated in several corruption scandals. The new president, by the way, called Sevgil last week and asked her to be his spokesperson. No, I want to return to journalism, she told him. But what's the difference between journalism and being my spokesperson, he asked. Our reality TV president, of course, thinks much the same way. Sevgil said she just winced and politely said no. Oops, seems I have made copies of the same page. So Sevgil, just a little background on her. We've been talking. She started out in journalism as a business reporter, mostly because it was the only job she could find in Kiev that would help pay for her college education. But it proved to be a fascinating lens into the tangled world of petroleum oligarchs and corrupt politicians and Ukraine's tug of war between the West and Russia. She found out just how tough it would be to expose that corruption when she started investigating the oligarch known as Ukraine's king of natural gas. And this is an excerpt from a piece that appeared in an international journal. As an investigative reporter for Forbes Ukraine, Sevgil Musaieva is used to people threatening her or trying to bribe her. But when she and a colleague investigated how a once obscure young Ukrainian businessman mysteriously became a prominent multimillionaire, they became frightened enough to ask for a bodyguard. We were in panic, says Musaieva, because all the sources were telling us, don't write this story. And there were good reasons for the Forbes reporters, and I should say that Sevgil wrote for Forbes Ukraine, to be scared. Attacks on journalists, including investigative journalists, really happen in the Ukraine. In 2011, an investigative journalist was shot in the head. Another found the door of his home set on fire. 2 people who worked for the newspaper that Sevgil now edits have been murdered after pursuing stories about corruption among Ukraine's power elite. But this oligarch had a better idea about how to stop Musaiev's, I should say Sevgil's, reporting. He bought the magazine, okay? Yes, Forbes, which is run by the same Forbes heir who runs the company's Forbes Family Trust and the Forbes Private Capital Group, which, not coincidentally, was pursuing contracts with the same oligarch, okay? Nice, neat trick. And Forbes International said that globally, Forbes' mission is to seek outstanding business partners with the same values and integrity that Forbes embraces. Okay, well, I think that kind of speaks for itself. In short, Ukraine is in many ways facing the same culture of corruption that we're facing in our country, the same calculated destruction of the media, and the strange morphing of reality television into our unreal political crisis. And I'll let you explain all that. So thank you, and join me in inviting Sevgil Musaieva.
Hello, everyone. It's my first time at Dartmouth. Okay, let's start. I was born in a country that no longer exists. The Soviet Union was a superpower where 300 million people lived. It was the biggest country in the world that united 15 republics. The USSR was the second in the world in industrial production, and it was very proud that the first human to journey into outer space was Soviet engineer Yuri Gagarin. This is a part of the truth in which my parents lived. The second part was that the Soviet Union existed under conditions of strict censorship. There were no human rights. 300 million people lived behind the Iron Curtain, and the idea of life in Western countries drew from Soviet newspapers, the main of which was called Pravda, truth in English. The Soviet Union created its own truth. From newspapers, readers could learn about the achievements of the Soviet Union and how badly people live in the United States of America. The newspaper Pravda, like the rest of the mouthpieces of the Soviet government, kept silent about the thousands of victims of the Stalin regime, one of the leaders during which the Soviet Union created a system of labor camps. Their main purpose was to fight nonconformity and maintain an atmosphere of fear in the society. According to historians, during his reign of more than 30 years, 3.5 million people were repressed and 45,000 people were shot. By the order of Joseph Stalin, a year before the end of the Second World War, in May 1944, all the representatives of my nation, Crimean Tatars, were evicted from Crimea. They were accused of collaborating with occupiers. Stalin expelled more than 200,000 people, most of whom were women and children, because men were still fighting in ranks of the Soviet army. For more than 50 years, the Crimean Tatars were forbidden to live in Crimea. They were also not mentioned in Soviet history and, of course, Soviet newspapers. They were able to return to their homeland only in the early 90s, during the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was 2.5 years old and my sister just 6 months old when our family moved from Uzbekistan to Crimea. The Iron Curtain fell and people living in the Soviet Union gradually began to learn the truth about their country. And sometimes it was very difficult to accept that all truth. I grew up and was raised in an era of big changes, when the old rules and foundations of life collapsed and a new one were created from scratch. We live an independent country, but we were taught an alphabet and mathematics from Soviet textbook. We celebrated Independence Day, but at the same time, a lot of people went to demonstrations on the anniversary of the Great Socialist Revolution, which gave rise to the formation of the Soviet Union. Significant changes brought the post-Soviet republic big problems. Economic collapse, unemployment, and inflations are related elements of that era. For the people, all these events caused nostalgia for the stability in which they lived for decades. Some took advantage of this transitional period. After several years in the country, a new privileged class appeared, later called an oligarchy. In the mid-90s, to preserve its influence on the country, large capital began to privatize not only Soviet factories and enterprises, but also Ukrainian politicians and media. A few years later, the Ukrainian media market was under the control of the authorities and friendly businessmen. There was no talk about freedom of speech. The president's activities were covered in the media only in a positive way. Channels worked on the list of topics that they received from people in the presidential office, and hardly anything could change that situation. When I was 13 years old, a murder took place and it altered the course of Ukraine's recent history to become a key political case of the country in the 2000s. The body of independent journalist and one of the co-founders of Ukrayinska Pravda, the first independent newspaper in Ukraine, Georgy Gadgadze, was found in the forest in the suburbs of Kiev. A few months later, the country heard audio tapes where a man with a voice similar to the voice of President Leonid Kuchma gave instruction to intimidate this journalist. The Gadgadze case led to anti-governmental protests. The investigation of this murder was among the basic demands of the 2000 Maidan, anti-government protests which took place in Ukraine. The murder of famous journalists left a huge footprint and impact on the development and credibility of the media in my country. Ukrayinska Pravda became the main news source in Ukraine. Many years later, when I became chief editor of this newspaper, its co-founder, Alena Pritula, can tell me a story of the name. All Soviet people knew the name of the newspaper Pravda, which means truth. And this word had an extremely negative connotation. We decided to give new meanings to old concepts. And after all, Ukraine is our country, where young Ukrainian exist with the past, the Soviet past. But let's be back to 2000. At that time, I was in high school, but this story greatly shook me with its injustice and cruelty. I did not understand how it was possible to kill a person just because he was not afraid to speak the truth and to criticize the authorities. A year after that, I enrolled in a journalism school for children. Soon, the local newspaper published my first story. It was a short information message of 400 characters. Parents bought 5 copies of the newspaper. Relatives and friends called my mother and congratulated on my debut, and it was on that day that I decided that I would definitely become a reporter. So I began to write for local newspapers. A year later, my city, forgotten by God, was in all Russian and Ukrainian newspapers and TV channels. Russian and Ukrainian television reporters gathered in Kerch. Ukraine and Russia are on step away from conflict. This was the main headline of the news that time. The whole conflict broke out around the island 8 kilometers long, known as the Tuzla Spit. The Russian authorities began the construction of a dam in the direction of the Spit to connect it with Russian coast. The Ukrainian side protested because the Spit was a part of Ukrainian territory. After a meeting of the presidents of Ukraine and Russia, the construction of this dam was suspended. Even then, as a 14 years young reporter, I noticed how different the presentation of information was between Ukrainian and Russian TV channels. It was very difficult to understand what was really happening to a viewer who watched both Ukrainian and Russian TV channel. How much Russian news differs from reality, I will understand when I turn 27 years old. By that time, from a student of journalism school in Kiev, I will move to being an observer and investigative reporter at Forbes magazine. I will leave the magazine in 2013 in a protest over the new owner. In October 2020, together with my colleague, we came across an unknown group of companies that started winning governmental tenders more and more often and monopolized the supply of liquefied gas in the country for several months. The more we investigated this issue, the more we were horrified by the scope of the abuse that this company was committing. After 2 months of our researchers, Forbes published the first investigation about the mysterious 27-year-old businessman, Sergei Kurchenko, who literally in half a year became one of the most important participants of this fuel market. Kurchenko was not an independent figure, but a valet of President Yanukovych. Before publication, we faced, and Alexa already told that story. However, the release of this publication was not followed by the criminal cases or liability. Kurchenko started to come out from the shadow. A month after the publication in Forbes, he bought a football club. Then, a month later, the country's largest oil refinery. Then, a network of petrol stations. In June, he bought the media, holdings that published Forbes, where the first investigation of him was published. All this will happen on the eve of anti-governmental protests, which were later called of Revolution of Dignity. In February 2014, the president left the country after shooting death 100 protesters. A few days later, the European Union imposed sanctions on Kurchenko and the rest of Yanukovych circle. 3 weeks later, Russia occupied my native land, Crimea. In May 2014, war broke out in the eastern part of Ukraine. The war has been going on for 5 years. During this time, the number of victims has reached 13,000 people. The onus of responsibility falls on the media side. The war in Ukraine is called a hybrid conflict because Russia sends to our country not only its soldiers or uses not only modern military equipment, but also information weapon. Russian propaganda has become an integral element of this war. When Russia occupied Crimea, the Russian media lied that the Ukrainian fascists who had come to power in Kiev were preparing provocations in Crimea. Russian television used the same rhetoric to fuel the conflict in eastern Ukraine. This strategy was successful. Some people who still live in occupied territories believe that Russia protecting them from Ukraine. It's challenging to work as a journalist in the war. It's even more complicated when it's war in your country. I became the chief editor of one of the most famous online media outlets in the country in one of the most dramatic periods of its history. The Crimea has already been occupied, and 5 to 10 people die every day in the eastern Ukraine. The society is polarized. The price of truth becomes very high, and sometimes people just don't want to hear it. For example, in 2016, we were preparing an investigation about sexual violence in the war. Women victims of violence reported on cases of sexual violence from both sides, from Russian and from Ukrainian army. When the article was published, I received thousands of letters in my email from readers. Many of them wrote that the Ukrainian media should not publish such investigation during the war. It harms Ukrainian interests and reduces Ukraine's chances of winning. We encountered the same criticism when we covered investigation into suicides among Ukrainian military and corruption in the Ukrainian army. Most often, we were accused of not being patriots of our country and helping the enemy with our actions. But we continue to do our regular work. I recall a story that was told me by the former editor-in-chief of The Guardian newspaper, Alan Rusbridger. When his newspaper published papers from John Snowden in 2013, they received thousands of negative comments. As a result, the British Parliament decided to organize public hearings on this issue, in which one of the parliamentarians asked Rusbridger if he was a patriot of his country. Without thinking, Rusbridger replied that he certainly is, because freedom of speech is one of the most important values of British democracy, which he intends to defend. With Alan, we met under tragic circumstances. He was the head of commission of the Committee of Protection Journalists, which was engaged in an independent investigation into the death of my colleague and friend, observer of Ukrayinska Pravda, Pavel Sheremet. Sheremet worked in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. On July 20, 2016, he died as a result of an explosion of his car in which a bomb had been planted. For me, this tragedy has become the most significant test of all time in the profession. I lost friend and mentor. This happened for the second time in the history of my newspaper, in one of the most challenging periods for my country. Sheremet was not just an employee of Ukrayinska Pravda. He was the soul of the company, a tutor, teacher, and authority. For our newsroom, this was the most painful blow, as if a chair had been knocked from beneath. It was so unexpected and so cruel that on that day we just silently worked in the editorial office. There were no tears and hysterics. There was terrible and deep silence. The year after murder of Sheremet, there was atmosphere and fear of despair within editorial staff. More and more often, my colleagues confessed to me that they do not understand why they work in journalism. They ask not to publish critical articles under their names. Our personal tragedy coincided with the crisis of our profession. In mid-2017, one of the national sociological companies of Ukraine published research according to which the Ukrainian media since 2016 lost about 10% of trust of the Ukrainians. It was a result of the previous years. Media in Ukraine became increasingly criticized for lack of patriotism, for biases, for the fact that bad news for us are always more interesting than positive ones. It was skillfully used by the Ukrainian authorities, launching campaigns to discredit individual media through pro-governmental bloggers and bots. Of course, this problem is urgent not only for Ukraine. The undermining trust of media is being debated and spoken all over the world. What kind of journalism should be there in the era of post-truth? How to maintain trust of the readers if any politician can call you a liar? The professional news media, no matter how authoritative it is, doesn't have the monopoly on the truth and news anymore. Somehow media lost its expert knowledge and know-it-all status of a universal reference book in which there are all answers for all questions. We live in an era when technology is killing institutions. Donald Trump does not need CNN loyalty. To contact voters, he does not need classic media platforms. He communicates with audience through social networks. Or the last example from election in Ukraine. The comedian Volodymyr Zelensky, during 3 months of presidential campaign, gave only one live interview. But he published thousands of videos in his Facebook or Instagram accounts. When I decided to study the topic of media credibility in the new conditions, my colleague, one of the most famous Ukrainian journalists, told me that it would be easier to write a paper on how to put the toothpaste back to the tube. You might agree with her. Everyone says that era of traditional media has ended, and only those projects which will be able to build horizontal relationship with the reader will be successful. So trust in media today is even more important than yesterday, because trust is the basis of any relationship. How can media regain trust? To answer these questions, we need to understand what is the basis of trust in any group. On empathy, on compassion, on mutual support. How long have we, as a journalist, asked ourselves the question, are we building relationship with our readers on these foundations? Don't you think that we are all moved away from society and stop explaining to people why they need us? After all, our task is not only to describe the intrigues of the White House or the corruption schemes in Ukraine, but also to explain to the public why this is important for them. Another essential element of trust is the truth. We can say the same about any relationship, and in the relationship between the reader and the media is the basis of the basics. Truth is the mass of our profession, and truth is the greatest value of our profession. Let us imagine for one moment, if there ever was freedom of speech in the Soviet Union and newspapers wrote the truth, perhaps thousands of victims of Stalinist repressions would have survived. Perhaps if Georgi Gangadze in 2000 would not have told the truth about what is happening in Ukraine, he would have been alive, and the Ukrainian media market still would have existed under conditions of censorship. What the truth means to society and what the consequences may be when it's hidden, you can observe in the new HBO series about Chernobyl. In 1986, the USSR endured one of the most terrible disasters in the history of humanity. The consequences of that were still felt in Ukraine and European countries. The Soviet government decided to hide the scale of disaster, nuclear disaster, from the public. Only a few years later, society would fully understand what happened in spring of 1986 in Chernobyl. I started my speech with the introduction to the history of my country, and I'm finishing with it. I believe that without understanding and rethinking history, we have no future. Based on the history of my country, I do understand the real price of truth, its importance and its real power, even from the most recent past. And I do understand that when your country is in war or when society is polarized, truth is even more important. And it doesn't matter if it's real war or is it war for democratic values. Democratic values of your country help to spread those principles among other nations. And it's now time to fight back on this disruptive moment of history. Thank you. Yeah.
So are there any questions? And if you do, we have people who could bring you the microphone.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I found myself connecting the collapse of the USSR, the Ukraine, the Crimean problem, all in a flurry.
I covered a lot
here.
of topics.
Yes, no, it was very interesting. I guess there is a new documentary by the German director about Gorbachev. I haven't seen it yet, but I was reading the reviews, and I guess it reinforces the notion that Gorbachev himself says something: I tried too much to get perestroika and glasnost together in one package was too much, and that's been repeated over and over again. So I guess at some point I'd be interested in what you think about the simultaneity of those two concepts, which you could elucidate for the audience, including me. But my first question was, everybody recognizes that celebrityhood is the name of the game, and you can be a celebrity by being a reality TV star or by being on television or being on social media, usually by doing something kind of untoward or remarkable. And specifically, though, I'm kind of interested in the rise of the comedian as a celebrity. Because humor, you might say, a lot of times is speaking truth to power, too, like journalism. Humor, like Will Rogers' funny remark, this country has the best politicians money can buy. And that's funny, but it isn't funny. And a lot of humor, it starts out being funny and then gets very serious and starts looking at the truth behind the camouflage and the false fronts and all that kind of stuff. Do you think the rise of comedians within the general category of celebrityhood is just a blip in the current moment in history? Or do you think that celebrityhood is going to stay the name of the game? It could be Hollywood models, it could be fashion designers, it could be celebrity chefs. Or do you think there's something about comedians that gets people's serious side? Or is it just that they're celebrities? That is, there's nothing about humor in particular, because a lot of humor, it's funny, but it's funny because it's very serious. And I assume that the new, is he prime minister or president?
He's a president of Ukraine.
Yeah.
He's a new elected president. And
did he do political humor? I turn this.
Yes, actually, he was one of the most prominent comedian in history of independent Ukraine, and it was a political humor, sure. And he criticized a lot of Ukrainian president during last 15 years. So he started from comedian show which was actually launched in the Soviet Union, which is a club of веселых и находчивых, KVN. Kind of, I know how to translate it. It's kind of different teams compete with each other on a sense of humor, and they also, it was a political humor actually. And his program was extremely popular in Ukraine, and his kind of support of a lot of people, I mean 73% he received in the last election, because everyone actually in Ukraine knows him. For the last 15 years, all main channels showed his show about political humor. And even during his campaign, he used social media, he used TV channel, but also one of the most important part of his political campaign, I mean presidential campaign, was that he came to a lot of Ukrainian cities with his comedy show. And and compared to kind of, if, for example, our former President Poroshenko came to a small Ukrainian village and started to talk about reforms or independence of Ukrainian church, and at the same time the comedian went to the same city and started to make jokes about politicians, and you can compare and who has the better chance to win elections after that. So it was also one of the part of strategy. And actually Alexis mentioned that before, that he was the main hero of this series, The Servant of the People, which appeared in like 3 years ago in one of the main Ukrainian TV channel owned by oligarch Igor Kolomoisky. That's why we have this strong connection between Zelensky and Kolomoisky, and a lot of people, even in the Western media, cover Zelensky as a puppet of Kolomoisky, as a man who is absolutely dependent from his money and his influence, and without support of, for example, one of the biggest channel in Ukraine, 1+1, I think that Zelensky had no chance to win that elections. It's my personal opinion. So, and this servant of the people created a new reality with a new president, that it's kind of, the story of this film, that teacher of history became a president of Ukraine, and how he's trying to deal with all oligarchs, and he's a good president, and a lot of people believed in that story. So his success in the president election was absolutely connected with this film. And actually, some of international TV channels even bought rights to film this story, and Netflix will do that in the next year. So I think that, yeah, not only HBO filming films about Ukrainian history, but Servant of the People, I think it will be an interesting experience. So, but your question was more about kind of comedian, and would they be more kind of, is it kind of...
I guess I'm incredible, because humor can either take you toward hope, or it can take you toward cynicism. And I wonder which...
Hope, I think, and cynicism is also so. I think that he gave a lot of hope for people. Yes, he gave a lot of hope with this film, and with his kind of jokes about political elite in Ukraine for last couple of years. So he criticized our current president and his friends and all political leaders of our country. So that's why people have hope for him that maybe something will change after his presidency. So, yeah.
So you mentioned trust, and what are the foundations of trust, and this notion of empathy and compassion for the people, and building relationships with readers and potential readers is very important for any paper. So especially in this modern era with like a fragmented media landscape, one strategy that at least top American newspapers are using is they're doubling down on their arts and their lifestyle and their culture sections, and also responding to this culture of celebrity. they're also trying to promote their individual journalists much more so as really the face of their articles and promoting like their social media accounts. So with this new strategy of like focusing much more so on lifestyle and the individual faces and reputations of reporters, do you think that this is sustainable with also the broader culture or traditional role of authoritative media outlets to, as an institution, speak truth to power?
Okay, the question is short version of the question. Sorry,
Short,
I just got
yeah.
lost a bit.
So short version of the question would promoting individual journalists as a face.
Yes. It's
and
absolutely I don't understand. Sorry, I missed because you started to explain a lot of things. Yes, this strategy for promoting individual journalists is absolutely right, and a lot of media experience that, and we also do in our newspaper in Ukraine. But when I'm telling more about compassion and about mutual aid and about integrity and cover topics of inequality in media, I'm thinking about that maybe all mainstream media in the United States focus more in that kind of Trump things and not explaining a life of Americans. And I'm very happy, for example, that this year both awards at Harvard University received Dallas Morning News with their investigation about pain and profit. It was about kind of system of medical kind of mafia in Texas, and it was very interesting. And I think that if we will have more that kind of investigations, it will also fix the situation with trust in media, because people want to know what actually matters them. So how media can change their life, and not only because for I think that for American, sometimes it's very hard to understand a real influence of Mueller report on his life, and even this Russian interference into elections. So we have this discussion between different media. We have this narrative, but people do not understand what are their role in that time, and this kind of distance between readers and between media and between political elite and people in power, we can fix. Just not writing only about political power, but about people and their warnings, problems. And Marty Baron, he received that a year Shorenstein Award for Excellence in Journalism. He said absolutely the same, that his newspaper, Washington Post, will try to fix that imbalance between covering White House and covering problems of real people in the United States.
First, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us. I really appreciate it. I guess my question stems from the fact that your newspaper is an online newspaper. And so I'm curious as to know what you think about the role of these platforms, whether it's social media or whether it's email newsletters. To be specific, because we know that a lot of people only follow the platforms that they want to follow and read the news that they want to read. So how are you thinking about kind of broadening the reach of, say, people who want to read investigative journalism, but currently, do not have the interest or do not have the, say, just the awareness of it?
Interesting question. I'm thinking more about offline events for media, and I think that in my media we will have more that kind of events to explain people our values, our why we do what we do actually, and why independent journalism is very important for people in all over the world. But I absolutely agree that even, last year I had a dinner with in Strasbourg where my friend leave, and he works as an ambassador, and he invited new ambassador of the United States to this dinner. He just came from the Washington, and this ambassador asked me, why do I need news? Why do I need actually media? I can read all news from social networks from her Twitter account, and she just he doesn't need to just to be subscribed in the Washington Post. She just can read it in her news feed. And I saw that, yes, okay, yeah, we do understand it, and it's very similar situation with Ukraine, and the situation that we, even Facebook in our country is more popular than Twitter, and all people kind of have a subscription for all officials, and they even don't need a media just to know opinion of Minister of Internal Affairs or General Prosecutor in media office. They just can read it in the newsfeed in Facebook. But I think that this reality created a new kind of bubbles, information bubbles you live in. And the role of media, I see that we also can explain that. And this situation with Zelensky show that in a very right way, because I was, for example, ready that he will win election even in January, because I understood what's going on. But a lot of people, I mean, journalists and even activists and bloggers, they lived in the kind of information bubbles where everyone supported Poroshenko. And they were very surprised when Volodymyr Zelensky received more than 30% of support people in the first tour, because from their circle, everyone supported Poroshenko as the head of as a president, as a candidate. So I think I see the role of media explaining that things that you. When you created your own page, your own feed, you have a subscription for people you are interested in, and it's very dangerous situation that you do need sometimes kind of came out from this bubble, come out.
So just to follow on here, so I guess like, what do you think is the role of these platforms? Like, do you think that Facebook, Instagram, Twitter has a role to play in terms of broadening the reach of, you know, maybe including
reach audience? Okay,
right, including alternative viewpoints or alternative media pieces.
Sure, and I think that media. Need to do more about find a way how to find readers from that platforms. And one of the example of this kind of successful story, the last story launched in Instagram in a Holocaust Memorial Day, when Instagram launched, not Instagram, but it was a project launched by businessman from Israel. It was a story of a girl who died in Holocaust, and it was in a short stories in her Instagram account, and it was a good way how you can tell very hard story, this very painful storytelling in a very simple way. So it depends from media how we can use social platforms and social networks to change that situation with that social media now are more entertainment and using misinformation, etc. So how actually tell very important stories with this tool.
First of all, thank you for your talk. My question is, like, living in a place like here, you might seem it's like a bubble. People understand each other academically, but coming from Indonesia, for example, not everyone has the same understanding, right? And do you think from the media's perspective, when you try to simplify complicated issues so that the common reader would understand, do you think the truth will be lost in the simplification? Because I don't see another way of trying to get more outreach, that more people read the news. It's, for example, the problem that we have is there is several media outlets in Indonesia who are credible, but their form is like a weekly magazine, like The Time or the New York Post, in which it's really complicated, the language is difficult, and not everyone has the time or the capability of understanding.
Very hard question, because you're everything that you have this choice between fast news and complicated stories, and how make this balance. And I faced with that all the time in my work. So that's it's, and for example, one story about a short story about that one member of parliament beat another one. It's a normal situation in Ukraine, actually. That one member of parliament beat another one. We can receive like 80,000 viewers, and at the same time, story from occupied Crimea about political prisoners in occupied Crimea can gather, for example, 4,000 viewers, and it's a main media platform in my country. I mean, Ukrayinska Pravda, and of course, even price of preparing these articles are absolutely different. So you understand that news story is nothing, and to send your reporter to occupied Crimea, you should have an insurance, you should cover your trip to Crimea, photographer, etc. So, but I do both, kind of, and you should give people not only kind of cheap, but healthy food also. So, yeah, it's the main kind of, and you should think about this balance between healthy and between sometimes chips, because people, yeah, they enjoy chips, and they need chips as well, kind of, but at the same time they need a healthy food too. And how to find this way, how to let them eat this healthy food, it's also one of the complicated story for me as an editor-in-chief of one of the main leading sources. Because unfortunately sometimes people prefer, even in situation with war, I described that in from year of war, for example, news about, we all the time published, we start our informational day from a short story, how many people were killed in the front line. And at the beginning of the war, we received like 80,000 years of that, and now use of that. And now we received like 2,000 views of that. People tired about that, but we are still cover that because it's important. So, kind of, okay.
Where do you get your revenue? Where do you get your revenue to support the website?
Advertising, but this model is vulnerable now, and we are trying to change that. And for that reason, I spent this year at Harvard at Nieman Foundation just to find a solution how to make my media organization sustainable for all difficulties we face now. So, and I believe that future of this business model will be more about mixing a different thing, subscription, readers, offline events, and advertising. That way we will survive, I think.
Thank you. You said earlier today that you're hoping to interview Rudolph Giuliani, and I was wondering what you're going to ask him.
Okay. Giuliani gave an interview to Fox News and told them that he's going to Kiev to meet with our new president-elect Volodymyr Zelensky. What is a question that it's a part of strategy of Biden participation in future election in 2020, and Biden's son was involved in Ukrainian case with one private company. He was a member of board of this company, and he received official salary in that company, and that company owned by actually a person from Yanukovych circle, our former Minister of Ecology, Nikolai Zlochevsky. He is a big oil businessman in Ukraine. And after Revolution of Dignity, European Union put in the sanctions of his business too, and he decided just to find some good guys to change the situation, and he invited to the board of this company Alexander Kwasniewski, who is a former president of Poland, and also a son of Biden, who is a lawyer. And now Trump people are trying to use the situation against Biden in the future election, and that's why Giuliani said that he wants to go to Kiev, but then in a couple of days he canceled that trip. He said that there are some enemies of Trump in the near circle of President Zelensky, and one of that enemies, it's my former colleague from Ukrayinska Pravda, Sevgil. Together with him, we published 2 years ago a Black Accountancy of Party of Regions, which actually launched an official investigation against Manafort. And the second one is oligarch Igor Kolomoisky, who supported Volodymyr Zelensky during his election and who is under official investigation launched by FBI here in the United States. So in the first case, Giuliani is trying just to this kind of say that fake news published story about Manafort, and you know that how it affected Manafort and how it affected Trump. And the second story, they're trying just to build a new relationship with the president without any oligarchs around him. So let us see what will be. I will ask him about his real purposes and why he said that Manafort case was faked by Ukrainian journalists.
All right, are there any other questions? Back there.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask you a question, and I don't know to what extent you could speak to this, but how do you see the landscape of being a journalist in Ukraine and being a journalist in Russia right now? How do they compare? And I guess I'm thinking of kind of things like Dost and independent media efforts.
I'm very happy that next year at Nieman program we have a representative from Russia. His name is Pavel Kanygin, and he is a reporter, investigative reporter. Pavel Kanygin from Novaya Gazeta, which one of actually only one maybe independent newspaper in Russia, just trying to survive in that conditions. It's very dangerous to be a journalist in Russia when you do your job not in a kind of level of propaganda they have. If you're trying to do your independent journalism work, it's dangerous. And even last year I had a chance to meet a girl from Russia during my short fellowship at Reuters Institute of Study Journalism in Oxford University. Her name was, okay, it doesn't matter. And she explained me a lot of things about journalism and how journalists are in Russia afraid of a lot of things. I think that it's much easier to work as a journalist in Ukraine, or with conditions of freedom of speech and transparency, level of transparency. compare with the situation in Russia, where if you're a journalist, you are under threat of even, yeah, it's very dangerous to work as a journalist if you do your work, if you're not kind of a tool of Russian propaganda. So it's very clear, you need to clearly understand that we have a small amount of Russian independent journalists and mostly like state propaganda people who worked in state channels in Russia, unfortunately. So.
Okay, I think we're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.